Okay.
All right, so we'll start. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, thank you, everybody, for enduring us. So I think Leslie probably touched on this, and I was doing something there for a second, but I think Leslie touched on probably the rationale. I want to go from 100,000 feet just real quick so we can get some perspective on kind of the mindset behind this. And our apologies, we're one day late. We had some dot loop. The purchase agreement was ready to go. We had it branded and everything. And we had some dot loop issues, so that took some finesse. And then, but the real kind of heavy lifting has been the accompanying addendums necessary for us to facilitate things in a manner that we think is going to be at the highest level from the standpoint of protecting you and protecting our clients and giving us the greatest resources to be successful. So we could have, frankly, and I'm sure, and I'm interested in getting some feedback. I'm sure some of you have seen resolutions that have come over that have been very, very simplistic. Just, yeah, seller accepts, seller doesn't accept, or excuse me, buyer is asking for repairs or not asking for repairs. And then it's, very, very simplistic. The problem is the purchase agreement provide the new purchase agreement. I'll say new and old for the purposes of trying to be clarify. The new purchase agreement, as you are probably aware, is very, very vague as it relates to the specifics of due diligence, specifically the inspection period and what it entails. So in order to better protect our sellers, we've prepared some documents that we would encourage you to use and to put up an associated docs section of the MLS as it relates to best practices to protect your sellers, because obviously it's a seller's market, and the benefits of this purchase agreement as being an adhesion contract, which of course means that it's written to the benefit of the drafter, which in this case would be the buyer. It serves the buyer very well. And obviously our market today doesn't provide for as much opportunity for the buyer relative to the seller. So from the standpoint of representing the buyer's interests, we don't necessarily need to provide these authorizations to obtain services, but which is one of the addendums that we're going to put out there that we'll discuss. But from a seller's perspective, you want to put it in the associated docs section, in my opinion, because it affords your seller the right to, in a more refined way, define exactly what it is that the buyer is going to try to accomplish, and also potentially limit some of the timeframes for them to achieve those objectives, because that's also in it. So it doesn't only identify specifically what inspections they're going to do, it also speaks to some specific time frames that might be different than what's allocated for in the purchase agreement if you so desire. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is the inspection notice or rejection addendum, which provides for certain activities if somebody agrees or doesn't agree, and goes through that litany of different items. That would be similar to our old A, B, and C. A being the seller takes it, B, maybe not with these repairs, sure, C, we're out no matter what. Obviously, that addendum doesn't work anymore. It's not relevant. It doesn't, the dots don't connect. So we have refined and created through aggregation of different documents, a lot of debate, a lot of time perusing over it, thinking about it, a document that we think it's a living document. So that's the other thing I want to tell you, that both of these documents that will be in dot loop to accompany the purchase agreement are working and living documents. We have about 25 hours in this thing to try to get this thing up to speed in the last 3 or 4 days, but we're going to be tweaking it slightly. So there's not going to be substantive changes to it, but there'll be probably a typo here or there or something that needs to change. We could have gone with a very simplistic and I would say a kind of boilerplate approach to all this, but I just we didn't think as a management team that it was appropriate, given the substantial nature of the changes in the purchase agreement, particularly given the environment that we're in regard to people's needs, wishes, and wants from the standpoint of representing the seller's interest at the highest level. So that's one of the reasons for it. So without further ado, Leslie, why don't we, and you tell me if you think this is okay, why don't we go ahead and screen share the authorization to obtain inspections and services agreement. So you'll see, so this particular document, the impetus of this, and you might say, well, why would I provide this document for my buyer? Because it limits my buyer's potential for more significant inspections or broad inspections. The timelines could be limited by the seller. Why would I do that? And in most cases, you may not. So you may not provide this with the purchase agreement if you're the buyer, but you may, because you may want it to make your offer more competitive. So there's going to be instances where you're going to want to use this authorization to obtain inspections and or services, and there's times that you're not going to want to as the buyer. My recommendation, our recommendation, Leslie and my recommendation, is that you utilize this, put this in the associated docs section with your listing, reference it in your listing because you're going to want the buyer that is making an offer on your house, the buyer's agent that's making an offer on your listing, more than likely, in my opinion, you're going to want them to use this because it's going to place some limitations on the buyer's ability to do certain things, which may behoove you. And it also may be appreciated by the buyer's agent because it puts them on a level playing field with the other multiple offers to affirm, exactly what it is that they're requesting. Because as you recall, in the purchase agreement, and we can speak to this in more detail as this conversation kind of progresses, but 18.1 is very, very generic in its approach. It basically says, listen, you can kind of do anything you want as far as due diligence. It doesn't place any restrictions on how frequently you can be in that person's house. In the advent of COVID here, that's kind of weird. I don't know that people are going to necessarily want to endure 4 or 5 different inspections on different days. So setting expectations about the way that this process is going to unfold, not only from the standpoint of how that presents itself in the sense of negotiating, but also the practical realities of people living in their houses and how they want to live in their houses and how they want their houses accessed for the purposes of this due diligence. So if you look, it's pretty boilerplate, right? It just says authorization to obtain inspections or services. So essentially it's saying, hey, this is what we plan on doing, and this is going to accompany our purchase agreement. This is what we're planning on doing from the standpoint of due diligence as it relates to evaluating the property. So, it has the stuff that you guys are all used to: whole house inspection. It itemizes out just furnace and air. It itemizes out just roof. It itemizes out lead-based paint, radon, mold, well or septic, and then of course any other inspections. It goes on to point out that that termite or home warranties or surveys are identified in the agreement, meaning the purchase agreement, and that this doesn't in a separate category in section 18. So it affords you the right, or the buyer, excuse me, in this instance, affords the buyer the right to those inspections, evaluations, in conjunction with the purchase agreement. And it just refines the fact that it doesn't negate that right by the specificity of these particular items that have check marks by it. So again, if such option is checked by a purchaser at section 15 of the agreement, purchaser hereby retains the option to have a survey completed. So the section 15 of the new purchase agreement identifies whether or not the person's going to participate in a survey. And if so, which there's check boxes for what kind of survey they're going to have. Secondly, 16 and 17, section 16 and 17, and this is of the new purchase agreement. So this is the new uniform purchase agreement. It suggests that in 16, that there's home warranty language. And in 17, there's wood destroying insects or termite provision, which is not dissimilar to the provisions that were in the previous purchase agreement. So we're just, as a result of itemizing these things here, since it's a separate document, we just want to make sure that it is clear that that does not negate those rights, in that this addendum and these items that are specifically stated here does not negate the other rights within those other provisions specifically. So that was the rationale for that. So let's go to the second page, Leslie, please. Now this is where it gets a little different. So we thought that, one of the problems with the purchase agreement from a seller's perspective, and there was arguments made. I thought April Tucker made a very astute point when she said, listen, 14 days is not a heck of a lot different than 10 calendar days, and it's not. So it might be that, this isn't a big deal, and you're okay with 14 days. But what it does is, the first one says, if any inspection test marked in this addendum shall be completed no later than blank calendar days after final acceptance of this agreement. So they have to have the inspections done by how soon? That's the first thing. And then it says the inspection notice or addendum or rejection notice addendum is identified in the agreement shall be provided to the seller no later than blank calendar days. So the first one is how quickly they have to get the inspections done. Second one is how soon they have to give the notice to the seller. Then it goes on to say, if purchaser has provided the seller with the inspection notice addendum, the resolution deadline as identified in the agreement, which is the purchase agreement, shall be blank calendar days after the inspection notice addendum was provided. Now, the reason for this is, if you recall in the purchase agreement under paragraph 18, in the new purchase agreement, it identifies that the seller's response has to be by the 18th day. Well, the problem is that you could have provided, as the buyer, what if you provided them with information as it relates to your inspection notice addendum requesting repairs on the third day? Now, all of a sudden, you got to wait 2 weeks, and maybe there's a substantial amount of repairs that you're asking for, and maybe that perfect house comes on the market between those 14 days, and you're obligated to keep your buyer in that contract because they don't have an out, because that's until the seller responds. So that's some consideration there. And also the other concern is, if it does get extended out 18 days, and you have a closing date that's, let's say, 35 days, you might start to run into issues with getting your appraisal back on time. So these are just some considerations. By the way, they're checked boxes. If none of the boxes are checked, then we just go with the regular agreement. So there's no harm, no foul. You don't have to do it. It's just, there's an opportunity. So can we get a copy of these so I can print? That's fair. Do you want to email them, Leslie, to everybody?
Yes, actually, you know what? I'll attach it in the chat.
Okay. So third one, or are we on the fourth one? Let's see. If purchaser provided inspection. So okay, yeah. If purchaser has provided seller with a rejection notice addendum, the resolution deadline as identified in the agreement shall be the same date as the rejection notice addendum was provided to the seller. So basically, it means your deal's dead. If your deal's dead, your deal's dead, so to speak. The last one, we don't need a checkbox there. So that's a typo. So when I was screaming in the middle at like 10:03, when everybody was listening to what a moron I am, I was just telling Leslie, we don't want a box there, because it shouldn't be open for debate. It's just all other terms to remain the same unless otherwise provided in this addendum. To the extent the language of this addendum and agreement are in conflict, this addendum shall be controlling. So basically what that says is, look, everything else is the way it is. If you checked a box, this controls. If there's conflict and there's gray area, this controls. So there shouldn't be a box there. So that box will go away. That will get done. The last three items, and we need this to say A, B, and C, Leslie. It says A, C, and D. So since we pulled that one out, so we'll need those to say A, B, and C. So so that's one other. We're getting there. We're getting there. But the mechanics of this, let me tell you, were not easy because it's complicated. Okay, so it says all inspections and services may be ordered by the buyer's agent or seller's agent if there is no buyer's agent. Inspections or services ordered but not used due to the sale failing to close will be paid by the buyer, except otherwise provided in the purchase agreement, and shall become the responsibility of the expense, not become the responsibility of the expense of the agent. Buyer may be required to pay for inspections or services at the time that inspections or services are rendered and should be prepared to do so. 2, if the items requested above require to be held in escrow, buyer and seller agree that all fees charged in connection with the findings held in escrow will be equally divided between buyer and seller. And 3rd is an inspector's list, if any, is provided for convenience only and is not intended to be either a guarantee or workmanship, nor an endorsement of that should say of workmanship, guarantee of workmanship. So that or needs to be of, or an endorsement. There may be other available inspectors or workers who provide similar or additional services of comparable or better quality at better prices or terms. The company you choose is up to you. So we're trying to mitigate some liability on inspections there, on inspectors there. Okay, so what do we got in the chat? Leslie, can you?
Yes, so we have a question about if whole house inspector calls out additional inspection items, but not indicated on the addendum, can you still ask for the additional inspections based on the inspector's recommendation?
So thanks for the question. Wonderful question. So what you do in that instance is you call up the seller listing agent, and you say, listen, we're going to need more inspections. So we're going to need an addendum that affords us to do the opportunity to do that. And if they say no, then we're not going to let you do any more inspections. Then you can say, well, then we're going to terminate, which is kind of the way it always plays out. So the fact of the matter is, in practical reality, you're going to have the opportunity to negotiate that. And the fact is, if they won't let you do the inspection, then they're probably not very interested. Because the other piece of it is you can put it in your request too, right? So, and when we talk about the inspection notice or rejection addendum, additional inspections can be part of your inspection addendum notice. So you could say, let's say, okay, radon to be mitigated. Let's say that's one thing that's going to happen, or they're requesting something else. And due to slow drainage, purchaser requests a sewer scope to the street. And then you could request it in your inspection resolution. Or you can verbally request it before you send it and get an addendum extending. But it's not dissimilar to what we're in practice, what we're doing now. Does that make sense to everybody? And we'll talk about the inspection notice and rejection addendum and where you're putting. It's very similar in the sense, it's very different, but it's very similar in the sense that you have an opportunity to ask for repairs, right? Well, you can ask for additional analysis in that repair section. Yeah, so we should probably let's see, not intended to be so Jerry's wondering about qualified inspector. Where are you referencing the word qualified specifically, Jerry? It's at the top of the other page.
I think that's a good just topic of conversation because I think in any transaction, when that comes up, there are some items that really, when we say a licensed contractor, are sometimes simple repairs that can be done by the homeowner themselves. And so that has kind of always been a good debate and topic of conversation, that do you use qualified? Do you do licensed contractor? And essentially what does that mean?
Yeah, I personally, and if we have qualified somewhere, I'd prefer to change that to licensed as much as we can. So if the category provides for licensure, then I prefer licensed. If it's if it's a smaller item, I'm speaking more in terms, we've kind of evolved the conversation, but I'm speaking more in terms of items that are requested and the repairs that are being done. I prefer licensed if it's an event that can be licensed. I think it should be categorically addressed in each item. For example, if it's a plumber, I want him to be licensed. I don't know that you have to be a licensed general contractor to fix a trim piece. So you need to have some level of discernment as it relates to each particular item that you're requesting. In regard to inspectors, that's a good question. Do we say, that's a fair question. I'm gonna have to think about how we want that to be worded. That's a good question. Fair question.
What's that in regards to, Tom?
Well, I don't see it. I don't know if it's on the first page. Jerry, maybe you can speak to what you're specifically identifying with qualified versus, if you're available to put that in the chat or or can we unmute Jerry?
It's like Brady Bunch trying to go through everybody.
Define them, I know, right?
Yeah, I like it.
Can you hear me?
Jerry,
Oh,
you're in
there.
the house.
Hey, well, my question was, when you select inspectors, every now and then you'll get somebody come out that's, they have a friend, or they have, as I say, Uncle Charlie, that's rehabbed a couple of houses and they want them to do the inspection. I think somewhere it should be addressed. It is before the legislature again this year that home inspectors will become licensed.
Right.
Pass or not, I don't know. But I think that's, and I'm not sure how you address that. Qualified, this is what they do for their business. I don't know, because there's some out there that are not as good as others. And I don't know how you look at, there's many of them that are ASHI qualified, or there's a couple others.
Yeah, so I think what we've used for discernment on that previously, Jerry, is one of two things. If you want to get really tougher on them, you can do the ASHI thing, which basically most inspectors that are worth their salt are ASHI certified. So that'd be one thing you could do. The second thing you could do that we've done for one particular gentleman that will remain unnamed, as you know, is we've gone and said that they have to have a Better Business Bureau rating for their business of a certain caliber.
And I would agree with you on, like plumbers, electricians, people doing the work, those are usually licensed anyway. And, but I'm referring more just to the inspections that are done.
Yeah, it's hard because of your point, Jerry. It's hard because of the lack of licensure status. But it's fair. I think you could say a professional. You could say something like a professional who is in the home inspection business as a that is in the home inspection business as their profession. You could say that. You could say an ASHI member. You could say a home inspection business that has a Better Business Bureau rating of over B. Or, if you want to get into that as a seller, you can certainly do things like that. Everything's negotiable.
Another question that comes up, I haven't had this happen very often, but is I feel as a agent, the buyer's my client, I've referred whoever it is that's going to do the inspection. I've been to inspections before where the buyer comes through and there's no agent there. I realize that buyer kind of becomes the client of the inspector, but many times they come in with, mom and dad and the kids and Uncle Charlie and a few other people. I really think that an agent should be present when they take somebody into a house. If I was the seller, I sure would not want to have their whole family come into my house when just the inspector's there, because the inspector is doing their thing.
Well, you could certainly request that, and you could even, I suppose, you can even compel it in the contract, but I don't think you can mandate it unless it's contractually agreed to. Because and I'm not saying you're incorrect, I mean, but there was a push, as you might remember, Jerry, because you've seen a lot more than I'll ever think of seeing. So you've seen it all. There was that period where there was a lot of angst about liability as it related to realtors. There had been a few things that had gone off the rails where people had gotten themselves in trouble from the standpoint of you know, certain things about potentially having material knowledge of defects, and you know, and there was a push where for a period of time some brokerages, or at least some managers at some brokerages, were encouraging agents not to attend the home inspections. Now, that's not a practice that I think is appropriate. I think at some point, yeah, certainly there's potentially some liability that comes from that, but it's our job, for crying out loud. I mean, if we're not going to be involved in the transaction and the intimate details of the transaction that we get paid a pretty damn good amount of money for, then why the hell do they have us? So I think at some point, the rubber meets the road, and we have to own our job, and we have to be, you know, professional. And we certainly don't want to say in the middle of that inspection, you know, the inspector points out that there's a crack in the foundation. You go, oh, you know, that's, if it's not an inch or it's not a half inch, don't worry about it. The foundation's fine. You know, of course, we're not saying things like that, but I always say you should attend the inspection. You should listen intently. You should answer questions that you're qualified to answer if they're addressed to you. You should be cordial and, you know, be communicative, but you should not do the inspector's job for them, and you shouldn't contradict the inspector, because that's not your position. I think, believe it or not, even Simmons keeps his mouth shut for once during the inspections, because that's not the place for us to be talkative. That's a place for us to be intently listening at the results. And where I think buyer's agents get themselves potentially in trouble from a standpoint of legal consequence from a buyer coming back on them is when they get really aggressive and or opinionated about some of the issues as it relates to a house, both positive or negative. So, but I'm with you, Jerry. I think we should be attending our inspections, and I think we should be advocating. But advocating for the process, but being very careful what we say.
Right. So. I would agree.
Okay. Let's see. What else do we have? Anything else in the chat?
Ben asked about the earnest deposit. So the new purchase agreement has language about the earnest deposit returned to a buyer if the sale is canceled following the inspection. Purchase agreement states it's less amounts necessary to pay expenses incurred by the realtor or escrow agent. Do you foresee that actually going on where the earnest deposit isn't paid in full to the buyer? And what's our company's position on it? And do we even want portions of buyer's deposits?
Yeah, great question. So this is my opinion. I just don't see a circumstance where we're taking, I mean, if you recall, and thank God it's going to come out, because we've got the listing agreements. Now that's going to come out too, right? Leslie, here real quick. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's pretty much ready to go. So
yeah, so we've been waiting on the listing agreement because of this. Well, if you look in that listing agreement, it said, you know, that the believe it or not, it says in there, which is antiquated. No, we've never taken the money, but it says in there that half of the earnest deposit shall be provided to the brokerage. I'm here to tell you, we have never received an earnest deposit, or I'd probably be on an island somewhere, you know, but no, we have never taken it. I don't see any scenario where we're going to. I think what that speaks to more, Ben, if I'm reading into it a little bit, is the provision that we have kind of outlined in this authorization to obtain inspections and services agreement, where you have some stuff that was done. So for example, you know, termite companies, they always eat it, right? They eat their inspection, their $80 or $80.25 or whatever it is. I think what they're trying to get at is, in the event that the escrow company was held, feet were held to the fire and they said, hey, you ordered this. I think what it's trying to demonstrate is that if any of those third-party vendors were to go after them, they want an out in the event. Like, let's say radon was or something was, or home warranty was ordered, whatever it is, some weird thing happened. I think they just don't want to not be out of pocket. Do I see us taking earnest deposits from our buyers? Do I see Green Title taking earnest deposits from our buyers? No, I don't. I mean, I don't see in practice how that's going to happen. But I think if there was something super egregious by the buyer that was like dishonest and there was some way that we could get stuck with it, I think it's appropriate to at least have that right. Something that was just super fraudulent, not something that was outside the buyer's control or that they were uneducated about in the process or their loan faults, nothing that is just in the normal course of business. But if a buyer was substantively dishonest, fraudulent in some way, and trying to stick us with a bunch of stuff, I think it's probably appropriate to have that provision to protect us in the event that obscure circumstances has come. I can tell you in the course of the last 10,000 transactions that we've done in the last 5 years, that hasn't happened, or that I'm aware of hasn't happened, but it doesn't mean it could never happen. So I think the provision is appropriate in the context that it's a lowest common denominator, worst case scenario, if that makes any sense. All right. So do we go on to any other thoughts, questions, comments, criticisms? Careful, our feelings are fragile and we're sleep deprived, so.
Yes, Tom, we are very fragile human beings over here.
Yeah. Not
right.
perfect, but yeah, go ahead. Anything else?
Tom, can you hear me?
Sure.
Oh, good. So question on page 2, and I apologize, I'm between my eyes getting old and the screen being smaller.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. I just, what can I say? Age sucks. This may be in here and I may be missing it. I have always liked, like, if somebody wanted to do an inspection and as a selling agent, you've said, okay, well, you can only do option A or C, take it or leave it. Is that provision in here, or could we get these marked, like A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, so that you can counter it to say option, 1 or 3 only, A or C only, that kind of a thing?
I mean, we can. Here's my thing. I kind of have a pet peeve about that. And I love, of course, this is Raquel, right?
Yeah.
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 I love you, Raquel, but I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate. The fact of the matter is, okay, I'm going to say it. Buyers are liars and sellers are storytellers. So I'm just kidding. Of course they're not. They're wonderful clients that we have. But the fact of the matter is that the seller is afforded that right anyway. They can say no to anything. And the buyer can say, I'm going to hit C. I'm out, in that world. Or they could say not C anymore. It's going to be different. We'll talk about it. We can do that anyway. And then they go, oh, wait a minute. What are you going to, oh, well, if you'll mitigate the radon and waterproof the basement, we'll stay in. Okay. So it doesn't mean anything. It just doesn't mean anything. I mean, you could write, so instead of saying A or C, you could write in the other provision on the inspection, you could say purchaser agrees to accept the property in as is condition, however, reserves the right to cancel the contract in the event that there are major defects or defects of such that they want to exit the contract. I mean, it's the same thing, right? You could say, hey, we'll take it as is, but we reserve the right to cancel in the event something materializes that we're unaware of at this time. It's no different, right? It's the same concept. I've never been a fan of the A and C because it's not true. It's irrelevant. I can always reject your request as a seller, and I can always threaten to cancel and tell you you got to do these repairs as a buyer. It's no different. A and C is A&C is a ploy that was provided for by buyer's agents intelligently, just like escalation clauses, to try to bamboozle, in my opinion, green listing agents. And that's, so, but that said, I mean, if you guys at the end of the day say, hey, we would like some language that's X, then we'll look at it. We'll look at it. But that's kind of my soapbox on that. But poke holes in that. If you think I'm wrong in practice, we'll talk about it.
No, I think it's good. I think I just need to like read this and kind of let it all sink in and absorb it.
Yeah.
And then even use it a couple of times, I think. But I also think sometimes it's easier to put in writing what the seller is understanding and what they've agreed to, because as we all know, people always remember the situation a little differently when, new information is provided 10 days later. All of the
You know what? And Raquel, that's a fair point. So I think from the standpoint of, that's a very good point. From the standpoint of setting
an expectation.
Expectations. That's a fair argument that, and I think that can be done.
And I have no problem countering anything in or out. What I'm trying to do is say, hey, this is a normal course of business, something that we do most of the time. So
sure.
let's just address that and take that extra.
What do you think about this, Raquel? Yeah. What if I wrote some language, okay, and we put it, because we've got some best practices language what if I wrote some language that kind of addressed it, and then you can plug and play in that paragraph. You just copy and paste it in there when it's appropriate.
Well, and I think, yeah, I'm totally fine with something like that. I think, and again, I think it's one of those where I've got to write, a handful of contracts.
Sure.
To be able to kind of, and I think it's, I remember years ago making a comment. My mother would always say, "Did you read your contract? Do you know what your contract says?" And right now, sure. I feel like a day one agent, and the next time a buyer wants to write a contract, I'm just gonna become like a doe in headlights. Like, okay.
No, it's tough stuff. Hey, listen.
There's a lot of changes. So.
Oh, hey, I'm telling you, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I have been I've had trouble sleeping the last few nights. I mean, this has been a big deal. It's a big change. And I hate to be publicly critical of people or entities, but I am not a fan of the way this was rolled out. I think it was rolled out horribly. But
can I ask the devil's advocate question really quick on that?
Sure.
Who all was in the decision-making process on this? And did they give any reason as to why the magnitude of changes was not given more time?
Yeah.
I feel like they were afraid these were going to be pushbacks. And so we're just going to put it out there and you're just going to have to use it. That's kind of how.
So it's a great question, Raquel, and it deserves an answer. And here's the answer that I think is true. And I'll let Leslie chime in because she's actually been more, not that she was given necessarily exactly what it was going to be, but she at least kind of knew it was looming, and had some knowledge of it. But here's what I'll tell you. They've been messing around with this thing for 18 months. Mm-hmm. And the impetus of it is they were trying to create some solidarity or consistency between Lincoln and Omaha in conjunction with the merger of the organizations. And the reality is, it was kind of a closed door committee of folks, and some of those were at major brokerages and some were not. And Berkshire Hathaway, for instance, was not really involved in the final stages of this and had a lot of issues with things, of which I don't know if they've addressed in addendums or what have you, but I can assure you that because I had a private conversation with Scott Boat, and that's basically what he said, that they had issues with certain provisions. And we spoke to those provisions, and he and I generally agreed on that, on those things, more fervently on some than others and vice versa. But the fact of the matter is it was done by a committee. They did bring it to the executive board ultimately for ratification. And frankly, we weren't on that board at the time, and now we are. So the good news is that now we have a seat at the table. It's really unfortunate. What happens is that the smaller brokerages are represented by one individual, and And the reality is that that there's not a lot of communication that goes from that representative to the brokerages that don't have a seat on the board. And you have to have 5% of the agents aggregately in Omaha and Lincoln. Well, obviously, if you don't have a presence in Lincoln, that's a pretty high threshold because you got to have both. But at any rate, we've been able to get that seat now because of our size, and we plan to be vocal participants in any and all substantial changes that occur at the board level moving forward. But unfortunately, we were 1 month short on this one.
Well, and I appreciate the fact that you guys are now, part of that, because that's something that we've been talking about, in realtor circles that I'm in, is just not just Better Homes presence, but making our entire board and realtor profession itself just better, and not, I guess taking the high road and doing things right and doing things right because that's the right thing to do, not because it's the easiest thing to do. And kind of like how you guys are approaching this. I get it. I understand this is what we got to deal with. So we're dealing with it. We'll all make it work. We'll all play fair in the sandbox. But, I just think it's good. I think the takeaway is just read the contract, and then read the contract again so that you understand what your people are signing and what
Sure.
you need to counter out for that client. So no,
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I'll use it a few times and then we'll, make changes if we need to.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool.
Any other? Yeah, thank you, Raquel, for all that feedback. It's very helpful. So is there anything else that's of consequence that needs to be discussed before we go on to the inspection notice? Leslie, you want to chime in on any of that?
No, I think I'll keep my comments to myself on a couple of these things, but I am on quite a few committees at the board level and, NAR level too, and real estate commission. So I can just say committees are just tough. There's a lot of opinions, there's a lot of personalities, and there's some politics that go along with it. And so sometimes it is hard to get things accomplished. And I think that's why it took so long. Not that's why, but this is a very critical document for us in this marketplace. So rightfully so, it should take a lot of time. I think that it kind of landed on brokers and managers' desks this fall. And then I don't think much happened with it until probably January. And they went, oh, we were going to push this out February 1st. So let's go now. So I think that was kind of how, with holidays, with COVID, with not being able to get together, I think that they just had some breaks that normally they would have been able to maybe have a little bit more preparation for it. And I think they anticipated having more preparation for it, but I think it just kind of like some things, they just kind of come up on you and you have to make a decision to either push it out or extend it. And they decided to push it out. So I guess, is it better now versus March, April, May, when we're in kind of the height of things? We're still kind of in the height of things now. So I think that it was either now or they needed to wait even longer. So
yeah, I guess my disappointment would be that they roll it out with no supporting documents.
Right.
That was my disappointment, is that it's, oh, here's this purchase agreement that's substantively different from the way real estate's being practiced in our market today, relative to maybe some things that have happened in Lincoln. And even in Lincoln, with that more oriented to due diligence, it still had the authorization to obtain inspections and services. That was a document that they had, and we tweaked it and changed it considerably. But we used that mindset because that's something that they had. Well, that encompasses the philosophies behind that more generic section 18 as it relates to inspections in the purchase agreement. And then not having an authorization inspection notice or rejection addendum that would be uniform in nature. I don't mind we don't mind making our own documents, because in some respects it's good because we can do it the way we want to do it. But in other respects, it's difficult because now we're trying to articulate more refined and specific documents to the marketplace, not only to buyers and sellers, but other agents, buyers, agents, and listing agents at different companies, all trying to administer to the purchase agreement with kind of these varying pieces. So it's a challenge. It's not perfect. It's taken a lot of thought to try to develop these things correctly. I think they will evolve modestly here and there. I think generally they're fairly solid, but there'll be some evolution for sure. Everything just needs to get better. But when we develop these things, we did it with the mindset that, hey, what are we going to do to create the most value for our buyers and sellers, and to keep our listing agents and buyers agents at this company as protected and give them the best resources to go to the marketplace and be successful. That was the mind, not to make it more mundane, not to make it more precarious, not to make it more complicated. And it probably appears that way in certain circumstances, but we just want them to be used as resources. So just to kind of recap, and you don't need to go back to it, but the authorization to obtain inspections and services agreement, that's more for you to utilize as a seller. So to counter as a seller. So put in associated docs and counter if you want certain things to provide them with, or set that expectation that they're going to send it over with their offer so that you can control the process a bit. That's the intention. Because some people might say, well, I don't want to limit my buyer. I'm going to take every advantage of what my buyer has provided in the purchase agreement. I don't want to limit my buyer's ability to ask for certain things. The reality is, though, in today's market, is that if you send that purchase agreement over as written without any specifics as it relates to inspections, it may hurt your ability for your offer to get accepted. So if there's just certain things that the purchaser is concerned about, it might be in your purchaser's best interest to define those things. There's not an absolute with these documents. They're a resource, and you should be utilizing them conditionally on the circumstances that are provided to you, and ask a lot of questions of your buyers and sellers. So the uniformity of the application is not absolute. It's more oriented towards situational circumstances. But we believe that the authorization to obtain inspections and the supporting opportunities to limit timeframes for those inspections and better define them more likely are in the best interest of the seller. More likely are in the best interest of you as a listing agent and your seller. And that's why we think it would be best practices to upload that document and the associated docs and set expectations. I think, and I didn't look specifically at the chat, but I think there was comments made about pre-inspections, and I would wholeheartedly agree that pre-inspections are of critical importance as a listing agent in today's environment, and you can mitigate a lot of the back and forth on this if you can do that. And I think it would, just to get off topic for one second and just kind of reiterate. In a market like this, when we're representing sellers, the greatest thing we can do for our sellers is not get 17 offers, but get a couple of great offers. Now, if we get 17, then we sift through them, but get a couple of great offers, 4, 5, 6, that have incredible terms. So we want to make sure, I'm not saying less offers are better. Don't misconstrue what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's not hard to get an offer that's $25,000 over the list price in today's market on a $200,000 house. That's not even that hard. What is hard is to get that $25,000 more at the closing table 35 days later, like the contract reads, because you got appraisal problems, you got potential inspections, you got all those things. So selling the house, putting the house under contract is you could send a fourth grader with a crayon. Getting it closed at the highest price on the terms that have been addressed in the purchase agreement is the skill. So as sellers, listing agents, we want to mitigate risk. So the way we mitigate risk is we mitigate risk on potential for financing falling through or inspections. And we and there's ways to do that that are better than others. And these documents have been drafted from that in that spirit. So just to be clear on that. Okay, so inspection notice and rejection addendum. So basically, this is basically your your A, B, and C deal. But there's not A, B, and C anymore. There's just there's what there is, which is you can say is it going okay there? It's the show. Okay.
Kind of bounced, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the purchaser's inspection. So you start with the top. Okay. So you've got the agreement, and it's obviously a permanent part of the purchase agreement, and it's obviously for the property. Put the property address, and then the purchaser's inspection notice with action request to the seller. Okay. So then it goes on to say, purchaser after inspection of real personal property identified and finds certain conditions of the real property to be unsatisfactory and requests that those be addressed. So those are in there. Where's the, I'm a little confused here. So so I guess I'm trying to get my bearings here. I guess if they, what it doesn't address is what if they just accept it as is. I guess you just put nothing in that box and sign it. I'm wondering if we shouldn't add some language to that, though, the more I'm thinking about it. Something, what do you guys, maybe we should add something that says, a box that says purchaser accepts property in as is condition or something like that. Because just leaving it blank, I think you could leave it blank, but I think we'll tweak that a little bit and put something in there so there's no uncertainty, like what if the print got because if the print got out of it somehow and the purchaser signed, and they could say, oh no, I signed, here it is with whatever. So I think we do need a box that says purchaser will accept as is. I don't know why I missed that, but we'll put that in.
Tom, I think that's important because, again, we need to set those expectations.
Yeah.
Everything.
So yeah,
writing.
I mean, they could sign it. They could just say, but I think in case, like I said, like in dot loop, like the writing got whatever left out and the purchaser signed. So I think we need to do that. So we'll do that. I missed that. It's been a long few days, but we'll get that fixed. So let's assume they ask for repairs. Seller's response to purchase acceptance. Seller responds to purchaser's inspection notice by accepting purchaser's request. So they could sign that. So what we'll do is we'll have a box that says purchaser agrees to accept property as is, and then we'll have a place for the seller to sign underneath that. And then we'll have seller's response to the purchaser acceptance, and then we'll go on and so forth. And then once the seller, if the seller accepts, then the form is complete. And we'll get an acknowledgement by the purchaser. Okay, so then you're done if that's the case. If not, and the seller goes on to say, hey, I want certain repairs done, or I'm gonna only do certain things, then they sign that. And then it goes on down. And if the purchaser acknowledges that, then they sign there if they're okay with that. And then you're done there. And then you go down and it says a purchaser's response to seller as it relates to they either accept the seller's counter, or the purchaser withdraws their request, or the purchaser rejects the seller's counter. And in that case, the agreement would be void. And then you just need the seller to sign that. And then and then they just send it back to the purchaser. On the bottom is the rejection notice. So we wanted to put it on the bottom. So Lincoln has it as another document. We decided to not have it as another document because it's like one more thing. So we put it in the bottom. So if the purchaser just rejects the property, it's in the bottom, and then the seller acknowledges it, and then you're done. So any questions on or comments on that, and understanding that we need to get that as is in the top line.
Everybody's quiet on this one. But I think that this one is a lot more self-explanatory when it comes to, we're asking for these repairs, they're countering, or we're rejecting. And then, yeah, like you said, we'll add that as is language.
What's realistic on that, Leslie? Can we get that in today?
Yeah.
Okay. Any comments, thoughts, questions?
Will it be the same for if you, if your buyer decides not to get any inspections? Do you even have to use any of this?
No, because if that's the case, that's identified in the purchase agreement.
Okay, so that will stay the same.
Yeah, so if there's in the purchase agreement, it says will ask for inspections or will not ask for inspections.
Okay, I
So-
just want,
Yeah, so if you mark no inspections, then all this is irrelevant.
okay, I just want to make sure. Thanks.
Yeah, and then item, and then those other items would prevail. So just to reiterate, the survey and the home warranty and all those other provisions would still be, just because you canceled or didn't want the inspection in paragraph 18, you would still be afforded those rights, which is identified in our authorization to obtain inspections document too, that it doesn't, if you don't check certain things or add them like termite and survey, if they're identified in the purchase agreement, it does not preclude your ability to exercise your rights as it relates to those provisions in the purchase agreement.
Okay.
Tom,
Yeah,
will these be loaded into dot loop as part of the purchase agreement?
so they'll be,
not as individual addendums, but when I'm working with older clients and they've got to go to all those different addendum pages, they might prefer just seeing all of these at the back of the contract, and I can say you can just ignore those pages because we're not using them, or instead of adding another document to be sent over and signed.
do you want to speak to that, Leslie? That's more your forms is more your world from the standpoint of.
I totally understand that point because it does add more things. When you send the documents from .loop and they only click on that one spot, it will take them through each of them as if they are their own document. My only concern adding those together is does that then, are we then changing what the uniform purchase agreement is if we're labeling it as such and having those all in one? And some people might not want to use those. Some people might not use the inspection notice. They might just go for, the assumption is I have 14 days to do any inspections I want. I don't want to identify those because the contract says that I can do inspections.
Okay.
You mean the authorization to obtain?
Sorry, the
inspection.
authorization, yeah.
Yeah.
New verbiage.
Yes.
We had a question about paid receipts. So is there a spot to ask for paid receipts from repairs? I don't believe we added that, but that's a good topic of conversation too, because that was on the old inspection addendum contingency.
Okay. So, well, why don't we take that verbiage on the old one then and just incorporate it into this one? I'll look at where we can put it.
Great, and then,
Sorry,
Oh.
this is Amy Ketchum. I asked a question, and Jennifer, I just saw Jennifer Colley just asked a question too, but I like to take, when I'm asking for repairs, I like to take, kind of copy and paste so they know exactly, okay, section, whatever, section 18A or however the inspection report reads. I like to take it exactly as it is from the inspection, which takes up a little bit more space, and I like to categorize them so it's very, very explicit. And so I guess it would be really nice to have a little bit more room where that purchaser inspection notice for actions requested is.
Yes, I totally agree. And we can play with formatting a little bit more. It was a challenge to make this just 2 pages because I think if we get into 3 pages, it's really just going to expand the document too much and kind of just bring more room for either pages missing or not filled out. So I want to play around with it so that we can get it a little bigger, because I thought the same thing as I was doing it, but it's
You know, one thing I like, Amy, just to keep things very clear to people, is I like attaching the inspection as an exhibit.
Oh, I do that too.
And then identifying it, you know, highlighting it right on the inspection, identifying it in the paragraph and see attached exhibit,
Oh,
identifying, you know, the
so
language.
not really writing it out, just say C 18.1.
The 18.1, and then
Oh,
right at
okay.
18.1, you're highlighting it, and then you're going on to say, you know, you're making it very clear that item is.
Okay, well, that
I
makes-
usually add the inspection as an exhibit, and then I identify on that exhibit specifically exactly if there's any change or if I'm not doing a portion of it or whatever, then I indicate that in writing on the exhibit.
Well, and I suppose in that section, if it was extensive, you could just write a little statement saying, please see attached addendum or something like that.
Yeah, I would not call it, so when you have a supporting, not to be a dork about this, but when you have a supporting document like an inspection report, like let's say the summary of the inspection report, it's important that you term that as an exhibit because it's not an addendum. An addendum is a document that amends what has been agreed to,
Okay.
or is an addition to what has been agreed to. This is a document that supports what has been agreed to. Okay. So they're executing. Now, would it be smart to put initials, boxes for initials by those items, you know, dot loop boxes for initials by those items on the exhibit? Not a bad idea to clarify. But theoretically, if you tie the exhibit to the inspection resolution addendum or whatever we're inspection notice addendum. God, I can't get the it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. The inspection notice addendum, if you tie it to that exhibit, you know, and you identify those specific items, you know, and make sure that you put, it's not just 3, it's 3.1, or if it's 3.11, you know, you identify it very specifically, and then you identify it in the inspection. And frankly, sometimes people struggle with how to take that verbiage and put it back in. And sometimes, frankly, we've had them where it's gotten jacked up. They've changed a word or two, or something's just a little different. And it actually is a problem. And I know most people just copy and paste, but sometimes it doesn't work exactly right, you know, what you're trying to say. And I get that. So I think we can try to add a little more space. I kind of thought the same thing, but really I like that inspection to be an exhibit because I think it affords us the opportunity to look at it in the context and the spirit the inspector intended. And that allows for less interpretation, which can sometimes, some subtle variance can cause us more grief than it would be if it was just chapter and verse.
So in that case, would you, and I always do include the inspection, but I just include it. I don't say see exhibit, whatever.
Yeah, so I would say see exhibit, yeah. See exhibit A attached herein.
Every time, okay.
Yes, that shall support this addendum. And then you can even write, you know, in the thing, you know, these, and you can even have them say, and see all items that are being requested by the purchaser shall be initialed by the purchaser and the seller. Okay. And you can have initial boxes by it.
Thank you.
well, if they, Patrick said, what if they won't look at the inspection? And if they won't look at the inspection, then I guess, you know, that then, I mean, but if you outline all these items and they won't look at the inspection because it's REO or whatever, then you're going to have to find, then what you could do in that circumstance, Patrick, if they wouldn't do that, then what I would do is I would write an exhibit. I would say, okay, see exhibit B, and then you just copy and paste everything, or see exhibit A, you just copy and paste everything exactly off the inspection, and you have it on a separate sheet of paper and it's still an exhibit. But I mean, that's if you got like an REO or something like that, but you could still have it identified as an exhibit. And more than likely on REO, they're not gonna let you ask for anything anyway. And if they don't want to see what it is, then mostly that's usually kind of shady, in my opinion, but it happens periodically. I get it. What Don had something, I just see these chats kind of, I don't go in the thing on, but what else is in there, Leslie? Can you administer the chat thing? Or are you talking to somebody? REO is so Ron, REO is real estate owned. It's a term called that's an old school term for bank owned foreclosed properties. And REO stands for real estate owned, and it means real estate that's bank owned. And it's just an old terminology that probably dates me, but it's just what people call bank owned properties. It's essentially synonymous with foreclosures that are owned by the bank or the asset management company that's administering the transaction for the bank.
Don had asked, we had talked previously about adding lines to clarify about insurance repairs on number 26, not just any contractor. And do we have verbiage or anything that could be identified on any of the addendums?
Yeah, so I have a very wordy one that I'm going to try to get more succinctly put in, but I'll read to you what I have that's going to go in .loop for best practices, and then I'm going to tweak it because I kind of went on a tangent. But it says, as it relates to paragraph 26 in the purchase agreement, purchaser and seller agree that in the event the property is materially damaged prior to closing, but after the parties have entered into a fully executed purchase agreement, the purchaser and seller will work with any and all contractors and insurance adjusters in good faith to reach agreement as to any and all repairs or replacements necessary to bring the property to the condition prior to the damage. Seller agrees to provide the purchaser notice within 48 hours of actual knowledge of any and all damage. Purchasers and sellers shall agree in writing to the scope of the work and any and all financial arrangements that relate specifically to the damage previously discussed. In the event the purchaser and seller cannot come to terms relative to the repair or replacement with respect to the damage or the financial terms to achieve such, either party may unilaterally cancel the contract, but by providing notice to the other party in writing. In the event the parties cannot reach terms within 14 calendar days of the purchasers receiving actual notice, this purchase agreement is null and void unless mutually extended by both purchaser and seller. In the event the parties come to terms and the work is agreed upon and performed, the purchaser agrees to accept these repairs and replacement so long as they are done in a workmanlike manner by a licensed professional. So I don't know how the hell I'm going to say that less words, but I'm going to. But that's going to give you something to at least work through. I think I'm going to just do, if people want to use something that robust, we can. I think I'm going to say something like, and I'm going to write it today, but I think I'm going to say something like, hey, you know, that I'm not going to say, hey, but it'll be this simple. It'll say, as it relates to paragraph 26, in the event the property is materially damaged, post the purchase agreement being executed and prior to closing, both purchasers and sellers shall agree on any and all remedy as it relates to that damage. And this provision shall supersede any language in paragraph 26. So I think that's what I'm going to end up coming up with. I think I overthought that one a little bit. So I'm gonna get a 2-liner that you can keep this one if you got somebody that's hell bent, but I think I'm gonna do a 2 or 3-liner that's gonna say that. Can the short language be added onto the inspection addendum so we don't have to counter? Well, the problem is that if we're the buyer, we don't want it in there because it's beneficial to the buyer. So we want to, I think we want to hold it out only for our sellers. Does that make sense, Don? Do you want to comment on that, Don?
Yeah, it makes sense, but if we're gonna put that, identify your inspections resolution in the MLS and ask for people to fill that out when they're submitting offers, could we have a version that has that in there so we don't have to counter on every seller side? And then have a version maybe that doesn't for our buyers? I know that's confusing if you have 2 different versions, but I would rather have that language in something I'm using already versus having to counter every contract.
How about so you guys, so you're going to know my ignorance and my lack of ability here. I've done so little with transaction management over the years for a very, very, very long time. Is it a total pain in the ass to just copy and paste it, put it in that paragraph, or ask them to put it in that paragraph? I'm a little concerned about putting 2 of them out there.
I suppose that if we're putting that on the MLS, if they could we put a box where we can write stuff in on that so we have an extra area where on either the website or the listing site we can write something in?
There is a box on the authorization to obtain inspections.
Okay, yeah, I guess underneath the other there is a box. Can we just copy and paste that in there for putting it in the MLS on our listing side?
Sure. I don't know why not. That makes sense to me. We'll figure that out. Yes.
Yeah, I hate the way that's written in the contract. That's horrible.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir. Apparently I thought it was enough that I had to make it 17 sentences instead of thinking about like, hey, you have to agree on this or it doesn't count. That would have been okay.
I have to say too, and I put it in the chat, but I just want to reiterate, I am so grateful that we work at a brokerage that actually cares about our opinion and has a conversation with us, because every brokerage I've ever been at before, they're like, here's your addendum, here you go. We don't care what you think about it. So thank you so much for being so thoughtful and talking to us about it.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's selfish because there's a lot of people out there that are a hell of a lot smarter than me. So I appreciate everybody's opinions and ideas. So yeah, and it's tough. I mean, we've already got 4 things we have to tweak, but it seems so fundamental. I'm almost embarrassed about the as is thing, but I'll tell you guys, it's so easy to get your head spinning on this stuff because it's so, you're trying to think about it. It's more than just the forms, right? You're trying to think about, okay, how does this happen in the trenches? And what's the if then statements? So you're having a lot of, conversations with yourself and about, well, God, what if this happens? Or, what if that happens? And it's hard to kind of anticipate what the roadblocks are until you kind of get there. It's kind of like practicing real estate, right? I mean, we go to real estate school and you get your license and then you're like, well, I should know how to practice real estate. You're like, don't know anything, right? You got to get in the trenches and you don't know until you know, and you don't know what you don't know until you don't know it. And it's just, it's tricky. And this has been tough. I'm not going to lie. It has not been perfect. We have not been perfect. The process has not been perfect, and we're just doing the best we can. But we've got, I think we're 90% of the way there. We got some tweaks we're going to have, and there'll be some changes that'll come after the fact. But I just appreciate everybody just kind of sticking in there with us. And I can tell you there was good intent with everything that we did. We were trying to look out for our buyers and sellers and you guys at every turn. There was never an agenda other than trying to make it as good as we could to protect everybody that you know, that we have an interest in protecting. So. I don't know what the question is. What was Aubrey's point? Can you read that to me, Leslie?
Aubrey was talking earlier about just kind of a helpful tidbit that removing the pre-inspection from the associated docs once you're under contract, because she had had an appraiser look at that and then ask for repairs that were noted on that.
Oh my God, that's brilliant. Never would have occurred to me. That's smart. Yeah.
Tom, my thought on that was to have you speak in general to that anything that you check mark on that last page is now a part of the contract. And, you know, really for an appraiser's eyes, as well as like associated docs, anything you throw on associated docs, you know, the underwriter can ask questions, the appraiser. So I thought maybe
Yeah, it's super great point.
thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great point. That's why I'm not I mean, I know it sounds counterintuitive because and I kind of wish they didn't list that thing out. I mean, I know why they do, right? So they list all that out because what they're trying to do, and we're talking about for anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about that last page of the purchase agreement that has all this, you know, stuff, pre-approval. I mean, you name it, it wants you to have it in there. And I know what, so the motivation to have it in there is obviously they want to make sure that, you know, that people aren't signing addendums and then pretending like they don't exist. And then the buyer says, oh no, here's your person's signature. And the seller says, oh, well, I didn't sign that. I don't know who signed that. You know, if it was a wet signature or whatever, I never signed that. And, you know, and stupid stuff like that. But now in the advent of electronic signatures and date stamping, it's like you can't really get away with it, right? Because we know when it was signed. We know it was signed. I mean, I suppose they could say, hey, I didn't click on that. Somebody else clicked on that. I suppose that's coming. We haven't had that yet. But I haven't heard that that's ever been a problem yet in this market. But I don't know that there is a real, to Raquel's point, and to Aubrey's point, kind of in an abstract way, the more information that we make available that aren't necessarily critical to the execution of the transaction from the standpoint of ancillary services, primarily mortgage lending, is greater susceptibility for a rock to get unturned. And while I think it makes a lot of sense to outline and identify documents that are supporting the intentions of the parties, it appears in our world today that it probably makes less sense to do that, even though my nature would be to say, yeah, everything should be included. That's a good thing. My inclination would, in the trenches, being honest about the way real estate is practiced, I don't know that anybody's ever gotten burned because they didn't have something listed in those attached items. But we sure the hell have gotten burned because there was some information that went to an underwriter that maybe didn't have to go to an underwriter, and that screwed up the deal. So there's not a perfect answer on it. It's but I don't know. I would be interested in hearing from anybody if they could see a circumstance where including all the addenda and supporting documents to the purchase agreement has protected their buyer. If there was ever a circumstance where you thought if you would have had that, it would have protected them, or the fact that you did have it protected them in some shape, way, or form. Has that ever been the case in practice? So we got 58 people left on the call. We had 71 at one point, which is pretty amazing. We have 58 people left on the call. Unless there's something in the chat coming up, I haven't heard one person say that they had. So, and there's some people that sell quite a bit of real estate on this call. So I don't know. I think maybe that gives you your answer as to where my head's at on it.
I don't know whether I have an answer to that question, but what I do know is that whenever I have gotten backed against the wall because, or my client has, and so I have. It's always because I didn't say enough. I wasn't specific enough, detailed enough, or if this, then that. I think the if this, then that language is probably the thing that if I ever have like a, well, this wasn't stated, it's usually that versus a document necessarily. I was fortunate and unfortunate enough to get in the middle of a lawsuit early on in my career, 19 years ago. And what I found out then was if it is not documented, it doesn't stand up in court. Doesn't make any difference what agreements anybody had, doesn't make any difference. So everything has to do with being specifically stated. So I think that's the biggest attention getter that I got early on was, can you defend this in a court of law? Is there
Yeah, I think-
something that, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, excuse me for interrupting you, Carol, I apologize.
So no, it's okay. I'm done.
Yeah, I think that is great advice. And I'm gonna get on my soapbox here about one thing for 2 seconds and probably lose 3 more people because I've said it so many times, but they'll click right off and say, I don't listen to that guy anymore. But there's the biggest thing is first right of refusal language. Go read that case study on those first right of refusal because and or contingencies, because what happens is that those are always very poorly defined, and the way they're poorly defined, to Carol's point, it's the biggest problem in from the standpoint of documentation. What happens is that we don't go on to define what happens if the purchaser falls out of contract on the home that they're selling. What happens? What happens to the earnest deposit? What happens to the transaction? So there's that Glenwood Road example in the intranet that talks about specifically about language that I used in a circumstance on a contingent offer. And you can't always get it all. You can't always get the buyer to agree to everything. It's written more for a seller. And the ambiguity actually benefits the buyer in most instances, which is why it's not better defined in the purchase agreement, because it's an adhesion contract and it's written to the benefit of the author. And so that's why. But I know that we don't have a lot of first right of refusal deals in this today. And I know we don't have a lot of contingent offers today. But that's why it's even that much more dangerous, because in the rare instance that we have, we're less equipped from an experiential standpoint and from a memory standpoint to address it. So I would just tell everybody, if you do have a first right of refusal or a contingent thing, please look at that case study. So there's some stuff about pre-inspections. You want to facilitate that a bit, Leslie? What's going on with that? Are you around?
Hold on, sorry. Pre-inspections. I'm kind of running. I'm running.
Okay, there's a couple things on the chat. Should I just pull the chat up?
Yeah, okay, so Raquel asked, the appraiser asking for pre-inspection, it would be the same if they wanted clarification on public remarks like new roof, new windows. And
Leslie, somebody had asked if the appraiser can ask for the inspection.
Gotcha.
And yeah, the appraiser can really ask for anything. You know, I had a situation years ago where we had a new roof, but the roof didn't look new. I don't know why. So he had actually asked to have copies of the receipts to prove that the roof was new. So I was just commenting, saying my philosophy would be, you know, make your public remarks because it is a selling feature. Add the pre-inspection information to the associated docs, because you don't want to play catch up, especially if you've got 26 showings trying to get everybody a copy of that. Just put it on the associated docs. Once you get an accepted contract, I would just remove it. And then if the appraiser seems to ask for it, then you could just do an on or not offer, you know, like, sure, I can get you a copy of that. No problem. You know, now, obviously, if the pre-inspection, you know, is a benefit to your seller, you may want to make sure you leave it. But, you know, there's nothing that says you can't remove the associated docs once the contract's put together. So, you know, remove it. And if they don't ask for it, then just leave it alone.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
I mean, it's no different than an underwriter asking for a copy of an inspection. That's not commonplace, but I have heard of it happening. So, you know, or just asking for a copy of just the inspection in general, just because that's a part of the contract.
Mhm.
So,
Yep, that's a hell of a good point. I had never heard of that, so thank you. I never once heard about an appraiser and or a lender asking about a pre-inspection from the associated docs. That's or from the comments. I suppose if it's in the agent or public remarks too, you would want to get it out of there too, theoretically, right?
I think you probably could. I mean, in my opinion, I think if you advertise something that's pre-inspected, it doesn't mean that you absolutely shared the report. So I guess I probably wouldn't go that far. But Aubrey's the one that, you know, it happened to. So I guess I think
But theoretically, if you're under contract and you're going to pull it out of the associated docs, why wouldn't you amend the public and private remarks
Sure.
at that point? I don't see how that's to your detriment.
Yeah. And there's nothing that says that you can't. So, you know, I mean, the thing I look at it is those associated docs stay with that listing for as long as the listing's on the MLS, which when you go back to do, you know, comps in the future, it's nice to have some of those associated docs because you can find out if the water issue was the same when they bought it 5 years ago and when those people bought it. So that's
Right.
when it's nice. But so, yeah, I mean, there's nothing that says you can't pull it off. So,
You know,
I think to keep an eye on.
interestingly enough, you know what they were talking about, and I, of course, you know, the problem I have is that I'm a realtor at heart, so I always come at it from the realtor's perspective, but they were complaining about at this board thing, and I just said, I think it's ridiculous. You can't. They're like, well, I don't think these people should be able to raise the prices in the MLS. You
Why
know,
not?
what? Well, exactly. I said, well,
It's-
that's ridiculous. You can raise a price. I mean, it happens in markets all over the country for other reasons. And I said, and more importantly, think about it from the seller's perspective. Forget that they're trying to chase the appraisal. Let's just say for the sake of argument that you're right, that that's one of the considerations. The most important consideration is that the seller may want to set an expectation to the marketplace in the event that that deal falls through. And that is at the total purvey of that seller. They cannot tell somebody what they're going to list a property for. And you can absolutely request backup offers and set that expectation that that's what the price is going to be, or that's what the list price is at that particular point in time. And that is totally within the purvey of the seller and would be a total overreach by the board. And I was adamant with them that I thought that, and I think we quelled that. But they're like, well, is that ethical? I'm like, well, it's not a question of ethics. It doesn't even enter the arena of ethics. It's a business practice based on best result for a seller. It's not fraudulent. It's not dishonest. It's not unethical in any way, shape, or form. It's simply a business strategy, and it's a property rights issue. And so I just said that's simply not open for debate. You wouldn't even stand up in court. You couldn't do that as a trade organization because it impedes personal property or property rights.
I think what people tend to forget is that it's not a list price, it's a suggested list price. And so it doesn't have anything to do with ethics. It's a business, like you said, it's a business decision. It's the price of a product, if you will. And prices go up and down. Look at GameStop. Prices go up and down.
Oh, look at Patrick just said that. So can we raise the list price for original price? Yes, you absolutely can. 100%. Now I will tell you. Yeah, Pete, I know you're going to say, I know that I just want to fit in, and then I'm going to get, I will tell you that, no, I'm not going to do that. Pete, you go, because you're better at this than I am.
Well, what I'll say is I've never sold, or we haven't in years sold a house over list price. And when the people are sending offers and they say, how do we win? And I say, well, we don't even know what's going to win because we're taking offers for another 7 hours. So, and I remind them that the price that the seller and Jen and I dreamt up in their living room is simply a price that we dreamt up in our living room, and that I think, and people have disagreed with me, that realtors can overprice homes as easily as they can underprice them. So it is simply something we dreamt up in the living room, and the market sets the price. And I think, Tom, you mentioned it about years ago when this whole skyrocketing started with prices. Tom said it's very difficult to be appraiser in a rising market. I mean, you're looking at comparables, but comparables only show you what happened prior. So if you're seeing a rising market like this, it's very difficult, not just for appraisers, but for realtors to come to terms on a price. I mean, we listed 2 houses that both got 25,000 over list a couple days ago, and every single comp said what we listed it at. So, and also we feel like what we did as realtors helped enhance that price. I mean, we don't take escalation clauses. We don't, we do a lot of things that let everybody know that this is a market, and you've got to put your best foot forward. So anyway, I think that's absolutely ridiculous that we even had an agent who said, we're not taking escalation clauses. And they said, well, forget it then, we're out. I mean, that's just a person who simply doesn't understand how a market works. We're not on eBay here, folks. You're not meant to sell the house for 500 more than the next one. Hate to say that. I mean, I'm going to still write them on your listings in hopes that you'll agree to $500 over the next one. But the idea that we're on eBay here and this is some kind of auction is ridiculous. So anyway, and also in terms of the appraisal, if you never sell them over list, I had one agent, when I told her that, she said, well, then how do you go into a living room and tell people you sell homes for over list? I mean, isn't that a feather in your cap? And I said, no, I got it wrong. I mean, I don't want to waste 20 people writing an offer on my house. I don't want to waste 19 people's 2 hours and get 19 people's hopes up. I want to try to get to as close as I can to the market price with, my experience. So anyway, I think with the appraiser, maybe it's worked, but I mean, we have not had a low appraisal we don't even remember, so I know appraisers can look back at what the list price was, but if the home was on the market for 2 days, why would they? And, people call us silly, and that's silly to do, but the list price is just something we dreamt up in the living room. So.
I think that's great. And I think one thing that Pete spoke to there that I thought was extremely valuable is, and I know this has really gone on. And by the way, a lot of people have dropped off, and I get that because we've gone forever here, but, and I'm happy to be here, but I understand that people have things they need to do. But I will tell you that, when people send over, I've had umpteen agents ask me, well, do I have to work with their escalation? Absolutely not. I want you to think about an escalation clause as nothing different than any other term in the contract. Do you have to take the price? No. Do you have to take the closing date? No. Do you have to take the financing terms? No. It is a term, and it's unilaterally provided. I would never, in my personal opinion, utilize an escalation clause if I was the seller. I would use it if I was a buyer, but I would never use it or never accept it as the listing agent because of all the reasons that Pete said. And here's the thing about it. A lot of people think that the price goes off the highest escalated price. That's not the way that agreement is generally written. But even if it did, it makes no sense to work with it. What you want to do is work with the highest escalated price, more than likely, that you think you can get closed if you can go back to those people and get them to agree to it. But the terms are so much more important. The ability, if you don't think it's going to appraise, how much will they come up with cash wise to get the thing to the finish line? Are they cash with no appraisal? What is the inspection environment? What are they asking for? Are they asking for anything? selling a house in today's market is more about mitigating risk than it is getting necessarily the highest price. Because if you get $220,000 and you know the thing, there's no way in hell it can appraise for more than 200. And even if you got 205, you're better off with the offer that's 210 that will pay all the way to the finish line. It's our job to get close. Now, I understand that we sometimes things appraise and we're baffled by it, but you have to really be cerebral about how you're weighing those offers from the standpoint of what you think what the greatest probability is to get the thing closed and to net your seller the highest amount. And I will tell you, and more times than not, the escalation clause it's never, in my opinion, the listing agent or seller's friend, because all it does is muddy the waters and confuse people as to what the price should actually be. And it's just another document that could be disputed in some capacity. So I would never accept an escalation clause. I always counter it out. Escalation clause shall not be a part of this purchase agreement. Price to be X. Okay, so anyway, yeah, so this was good. We're going to try to get our act together and make these changes. And then we'll probably put another one in there, and it'll be a little different in a week because we'll have to make a couple more changes. But just, I'm very appreciative of how much energy and effort everybody has placed in their understanding of these agreements. I want to thank everybody in from our staff standpoint that have worked diligently to help us get these Word documents put together. And I'm very grateful for all Leslie's hard work on this. She spent a lot of time on this. Very appreciative to her and everybody else that has been a part of the solution here. So I want to thank everybody. Is there any parting comments or is there anything else in the chat that would be relevant and kind of in closing here?
Yeah, Tom, will you touch base? Ben had brought up it's just a change now that we don't have the buyer sign a purchaser's receipt once the seller accepts it. It looks like on page 8, it's just stated once they sign the contract before it's presented to the seller that they acknowledge receipt of a signed copy of the purchase agreement as well as estimated closing cost statement if required by law. So then the seller accepts it. Once the seller accepts it, it's done. Nobody needs to sign anything else. That's different than we were used to.
Because normally you wanted to get the purchaser's receipt. So here's what I'll tell you. They have to provide actual notice. And I frankly don't agree with the way they've done that because it doesn't implicitly demonstrate that the purchaser is in receipt of the seller's acceptance, which I think is a problem. But right. It's a very good point. I don't know. I'm gonna have to work on that. I would. It's a fair point because the problem is that if the seller holds it and doesn't send it back, then you gotta. But it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg because what's to suggest that the purchaser's receipt, if it's executed, the purchaser's agent still has to send it back to the seller to demonstrate that that's been executed. So I just think we're going to have to be more diligent in making sure that that we get fully executed contracts and just,
And it's been, I asked because sometimes the buyer writes a really high offer and the seller takes it because it's amazing, even before the other offers come in, and you get a little worried at that point. Is the buyer a little worried we took their great offer so quickly? Buyer knows they maybe overwrote, and then they'd have to sign a final time to say, I really meant what I told you guys as sellers. And it's always a little nerve-wracking when the seller takes it and the buyer has to reaffirm that they commit to that offer. And now they don't. They don't have to, right? If the seller takes it in the time frame and sends it back to buyer's agent within the time frame, the buyer is fully bound to the terms of the terms and conditions. Now, that's how it appears now.
Well, I would argue, Ben, that they were bound to the terms before, because to suggest that the purchaser's receipt does not say purchaser's validation. It said purchaser's receipt. So I would argue that that is not the case. I would argue that when that, and it's maybe moot at this point, but I would argue that when that purchase agreement went over to the purchaser and the seller executed it and it came back, that if the seller can prove through email or otherwise that the purchaser had actual knowledge of receipt, or the agent being from an agency perspective, their agent was in receipt, that's a fully executed contract. That the purchaser's receipt is simply an acknowledgement to make sure that they know that they've received it. But it doesn't, it would not, you couldn't say, oh, I'm not going to sign the purchaser's receipt. All the seller would have to do, in my opinion, this is my opinion, not a lawyer, but all the seller would have to do is be able to provide proof that they executed the contract and made it available, and could demonstrate that they made it available to the purchaser. And that's an executed contract, in my opinion.
Well, and
Because
Tom, Tom, you remember those agents that don't sign the purchaser's receipt? I think we talked about it once, where the agent, it was years ago, but they didn't sign the purchaser's receipt, and they said, we don't sign that until closing day. And there was just a host of agents that would not sign that purchaser's receipt because the verbiage in that said it was a fully executed contract. Well, it's not fully executed contract in their mind, at least, until closing date. So they never signed the purchaser's receipt. And so you were left sitting there saying, okay, we have a deal, but they don't want to sign the purchaser's receipt. And it was more than a few agents when we would get contracts. And Jen and I finally were like, whatever, you know what I mean? Just, we have it, like you said, we have a contract, even if they don't sign that purchaser's receipt. So maybe that was behind the decision to remove that from the contract.
That's
So
fair
anyway.
point, Pete. I don't remember that, but that's a good explanation. I mean, think about it in these terms, Ben. It would have to say, if it said this contract is conditional upon purchaser acknowledging and accepting the seller's acceptance, and in their discretion, they can cancel the contract within 48 hours of receipt from the seller or something like that, then your argument would have merit. It doesn't say purchaser's acknowledgement. It doesn't say purchaser's ratification. It says purchaser's receipt, meaning that they're in receipt of the seller's intention. That's why I think it's binding, regardless of whether they sign the purchaser's receipt or not, in my opinion.
Hey, Tom. Kristen had also asked about the real estate certification, and I actually hadn't noticed that wasn't in there. So good catch, Kristen. That's something that's required by a lender. So are we going to have issues now that that's not in there?
I don't know.
Can let me say something. I found it actually. It's on page 8, and it's below the final checkbox section. And it says, the undersigned parties executed this agreement, and each individual executing this agreement on behalf of an entity represents and warrants that he or she is duly authorized to do so. Isn't that the certification?
That's not the real estate certification.
Okay.
The real estate certification, I've got the old one here.
Yeah.
Said that all the parties, sellers, etc., involved in this transaction, each certified to the terms of the purchase agreement are true to the best of our knowledge and belief, and that any other agreement entered, blah, 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 is attached to this purchase agreement. I know that started originally just for FHA and VA, but that real estate certification made it our way into its, these contracts. I don't know if it was 18 when it made it, but it's been in there for, I'd say, at least 5 years or so.
I think it was in that 4-pager that the board had forever. I think so. Yeah. I guess, if FHA, I'm sure they'll put something in the addendum or something that's required. I mean, I don't know. You know, again, I'm not a lawyer. I pontificate a lot, but I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about all the time. I mean, it seems a little redundant to me that somebody has to say that everything they put in something is true. I mean, if you sign something and you know it's not true, that's fraud. So do we really have to say that we're telling the truth? Now you have to sign that you're telling the truth when you said something. I mean, that seems counterintuitive to me. I don't know. I can't imagine. I'll ask Mark Lapuzza. I'll ask him, that's the attorney for the board. I'll ask him what his thoughts are in regard to certification and as it relates to paragraph 8 that you alluded to, Kristen, if they feel like that suffices from the standpoint of some legal standard. But I think what probably happened is they were having trouble getting people to go back and sign those things, and they didn't think they served any purpose. So that's why they got rid of them. That maybe the purchaser's receipt too, but I don't know.
That's
It's
'cause
fun,
buyers
isn't it?
are liars.
Yeah,
They didn't want to sign it.
right. It's fair. I don't know. It's a fair point. It's just, these are the cards we got dealt, so. I'll ask Mark Lapuzza though. That's a good question.
Tom, thank you very much.
No, thank you guys. Appreciate everybody's insight. Great dialogue, really smart thoughts. Already, of course, we've seen a few things that we screwed up, so we'll fix it. But
Tom, can I ask one final question? It's Ben.
Of course, Ben.
I could see weeks or months, we'll get a mix of contracts, I presume, from agents from smaller companies and things. Is that all okay? If I get a dynamite offer with an old purchase agreement, should we as agents just work within the frames of both of them, or are we going to expect agents catch up? What's your recommendation?
You know what, Ben, it's a great thought, and I really appreciate you bringing it up, and it's something I should have led with. So thank you for that, and sorry that I wasn't clear about this to begin with. We're in the business of selling stuff. That other contract is fine. You know, I don't think there was anything wrong with it to begin with, particularly other than maybe a few things that they could have changed. I would not get into having people rewrite contracts, but I would say that if there's anything that's particularly important to your seller, that you make sure that you are really careful about making sure that there's an apples to apples comparison from the standpoint of the terms that are of great consequence. I don't think it makes any sense to pound somebody into the ground because their brokerage doesn't have the new agreement. They theoretically can write a contract on any purchase agreement. So they're not obligated. And it wasn't very long ago that purchase agreements were different for all the major companies. I mean, we're talking not a decade, more than that, but not a heck of a lot more than that. So I would say that I would work with the other contract. I would just make sure that when you're presenting it to your seller, that you're very careful to identify anything from a term standpoint that could be substantively different between the two contracts, and make sure that when you're going back for highest and best in those circumstances that you're asking for highest and best or clarifying, that you take a leadership position as the listing agent and set expectations about how you want those terms to read. If that makes any sense.
Is anyone going to ask for people to remember to use the new one in their agent remarks, along with the request that they use the inspection authorization form?
Should you, or are they? Are you asking for other people's input?
Well, I think I'm going to ask people to do that and remind them. Curious if anyone else is planning to do that.
Probably in a week or two. I'd give them a little time. It's going to be a minute.
That's why they need the reminder.
I'm going to leave that to your guys' discretion. I feel like that's a personal decision, and you guys need to run your businesses. You know, we're here to help. We're not here to get in the middle of between your. If it's legal and it's ethical, you can do it here. That's the rule. And I know we pushed this agreement out a bit, but I just didn't want us to get way behind on this. And I just felt like it was important that we didn't get behind this thing. And it's not perfect. And I'm, kind of imparting. I want to tell you how much I appreciate how you guys have just dug in on this, because there could have been a lot of pushback, and it's not perfect. It is not. And there's going to be some heavy lifting, but I do appreciate everybody's willingness to give it a shot.
Allison, to respond to your comment, I don't see why you couldn't. I mean, goodness gracious, the Lincoln agents did that as soon as we merged. They said you must put in any offers using the Lincoln purchase agreement. So absolutely do what you need to do.
You guys made it there's 46 people that made it 2 hours. Gee, many Christmas. That's pretty impressive.
Well, Tom, there's only 500 houses on the market. We got to know how to sell them.
Yeah,
So.
Isn't that the truth? Brutal, isn't it? Just brutal.
Do you guys have another training tentatively like maybe next Tuesday, for example, once we've all had a chance to let this all sink in and maybe hopefully write a contract or two?
Yeah, so we're going to do them a couple a week in different iterations for a long time. So I would say it could even be before Tuesday.
Oh, okay.
But we'll plan on this time next Tuesday as well. Let's just plan we'll have weekly sessions at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays until we've got all the stuff we've screwed up right at a minimum. So, but let's just keep talking. Let's keep poking holes. Let's keep talking. We're not obviously going to do revisions daily because that would get cumbersome. We're going to make these changes, obviously, that are pretty prominent, that were oversights or misses. And then we'll probably go another week, and then unless there's something super egregious that we've all managed to miss. And then we'll go, and then we'll do it. But we're not going to be switching these things in and out of dot loop every day. That's just not practical. But we are not going to quit evolving. It is important that we keep moving forward and we keep best practices in mind. And so I am going to post a best practices seller response document. Leslie will, and I'm going to tweak a couple things. I'm going to give a shorter version of paragraph 26. And then I have a bunch of stuff in there about the buyer's inspection stuff, but I think we'll probably pull that out since we have the the authorization to obtain inspections agreement. But there's 4 or 5 other items that we're going to put in there, and we didn't get to today, but I know that your ears are bleeding from listening to me, and I don't blame you. So I'm going to leave you alone, and we'll work on those and get those posted. The changes to this on the inspection notice and rejection addendum and the authorization to obtain inspections and services document will be in dot loop functional today. I believe the purchase agreement, we've got the dot loop issue resolved, and I believe it's functional and can be downloaded if they tell me if I heard that correctly. So here we go, right? Upward and onward. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks, Tom.